I got into an article today, another rabbinic prophecy that talked about actually the Russian invasion of Crimea, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen referenced already, and it just um, came to me, I guess, that there's been several uh, rabbinic prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, and they're pointing to the same couple of year period, roughly, and um, it doesn't quite line up with our timeline that we've been looking at, and so I want to get into it and maybe give an explanation of what's going on here. So first I want to note is, in John chapter 5, verse 42 through 44, this is Jesus speaking. I was in Bible study tools. Typically I'm in eSword or one of the other tools, but I was checking the commentaries because I really wanted to get this right, understand what was going on. Um, it's these verses here that I was thinking about. But I know you, that ye have not the love of God in you. I am come in my Father's name, and ye receive me not. If another shall come in his own name, him you will receive. How can you believe which receive honor uh, one of another, and seek not the honor that cometh from God only? So, if you get into the commentaries on this, it was talking about, Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees and the religious authorities at the time, and he was basically saying that they're not receiving the one that comes from God, but that they will receive someone who comes in his own name. And so the commentaries kind of point out a couple of things. One is the rebellious pride of the Pharisees, which Jesus pointed to many times, prevented them from accepting Jesus. He didn't have the credentials of the rabbis. He didn't come up through the ranks of the rabbis. He was a rebel. He changed their sort of their uh, rabbinically developed doctrines in a lot of cases, and so he was a heretic to them in many ways. And so here Jesus is castigating them, saying that they're not receiving the one that came from the Father, but they'll receive one that comes in his own name. And according to the commentaries here, there was pride being pointed to. There was also the history of the Jewish people trying to point to certain, human individuals as the Messiah. And, over time, that's happened several times where at least a sect of Judaism thought that they had found the Messiah in somebody else in the last 2,000 years, only to be wrong. And then a couple of the commentaries said that it's more likely pointing to the Antichrist, which is kind of where my head was going, because it's pointing to a specific person in my name, uh, in my mind, because it says, another him you will receive, not you receive them. It's pointing to an individual, and yet they had a lot of false starts with prior possible messiahs, but this is pointing to the Antichrist would be the commentaries that I would agree with. And so given that, what this is representing is it's saying it's a prediction from Jesus that the disbelieving Jews in the Messiah, Jesus, would accept the Antichrist. And there's some other, verses where we know where, in Matthew, they're told to go, I think it's Matthew, no, Revelation 13 maybe. They're fleeing to the mountains, in other words, and they're um, heading for Petra. A lot of people say the Jewish people are when they recognize uh, the abomination of desolation, and that many people say, well, that's what the Antichrist sets up in the temple that's going to be built. And so they do come to a recognition that something's horribly wrong when the abomination of desolation shows up. Now let's go to our working hypothesis. I know I'm rather excited about this picture from Reese Wise, um, only because it just it feels like he's used the signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and in Genesis 1, the sun, moon, and stars were for signs and for seasons, right? And so this is exactly what we're seeing in this chart, and it fits together. And I went through this before, but the day counts confirm forwards and backwards the interpretation. So it's my working hypothesis, but you know what? I'll still be doing videos on September 23rd, 2017 if none of this comes to pass, right? So it's uh, you got to hold on to things loosely, but I got to say I'm you know anxious, let's say, about uh, this coming to pass. Now I actually had my old hopes up, and I'm sure Reese did as well here with the 2000 or the 6,000 year happening on April 1st, and we kind of slid past that, but that was just conjecture. There was no that wasn't part of these signs and symbols going on. It was just conjecture. So what I'm going to do is show you the three prophecies I started looking at then, and then we can debate whether this all fits into the greater plan that we've got in this chart. But if we're looking at the middle of the tribulation period being marked um, by this Revelation 12 sign, roughly, I know we got the day counts here that are giving us our guide. Then somewhere, in 2017, we're going to have the abomination of desolation, and if this is right, on September 23rd, and Israel flees. So he's got that Israel going to the mountains. So the Jewish folks, at least some portion of them, flee because they recognize that what's going on in the temple is the abomination of desolation. So if you back up from that, you have to have the Antichrist revealed because he signs and participates in the covenant, which would roughly be here. And hang on a second. So the point being is somewhere between May 14th, let's say. Well, actually, between now and September 23rd, the Antichrist would have to show up. He would have to rise to power. He would participate in the signing of the covenant with the Jewish people. The temple would be built, and then he would enter the temple and potentially set up the abomination of desolation in the Holy of Holies. And so it assumes if all that's going to happen, that the Jewish people, let's say politically anyways, accept the Antichrist um, as the Messiah. And so, and I say that because we know that once we're in the tribulation period, you have in Revelation 7, the 144,000 Jews who were identified as followers of Christ. You pick that up in Revelation 14. They follow him wherever he goes. And so I'm going to say, it's the political Judaism or the political Israel that accepts the Antichrist as the Messiah. And, I'm sure part of the religious Jews will as well if you use the template of Antiochus Epiphanes from whatever that was, 167 BC. He was actually uh, brought into Israel. They sought his protection, and so some of the religious rabbis helped bring in Antiochus Epiphanes, who defiled the temple back then, and that being a type, a very very crisp one, if you ask me, of what's going to happen in the tribulation period. So yes, the Antichrist would be invited in by some subset of the religious Jewish order as well as the political Israel. But there is, like I say, the 144,000 that clearly are following Christ. So there's a messianic movement occurring at the same time. Quite dynamic. So anyways, let's put this down. Thanks again to brother there. I go too slow for you to see me. Out on Facebook is Reese Wise. Sorry about that. Let's go now. We looked at that passage. Let's take a look at this first prophecy. So this one's 18th century Rabbi Elijah ben Shlomo Zalman Kramer, known as the Vilna Gaon, predicted the Russian invasion of Crimea is the beginning of the end, and the Messiah's footsteps can be heard, a bell that signals the arrival of someone or something. So here you go. When you hear that the Russians have invaded Crimea, you'll know that the bells of Galua have begun to ring. When you hear that the Russians have reached Constantinople, which is today's Istanbul, Turkey, you can already don Shabbos clothes and await Mashiach's appearance. When Russia captures the city of Crimea, then you will start to hear the footsteps of the Messiah are near. And so this one's been making the rounds quite a bit now after Russia moved into Crimea. And now there's all sorts of things going on where pro-Russian rebels are stirring up all sorts of trouble in the government buildings uh, in the eastern part of the country. And, everybody that's watching this thinks that Putin has intention to broaden his control over the region. And, if you want to go to Prophecy in the News and look at their current daily update, they're actually talking about that this is probably the start of Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is what's getting referenced down here as well. So it's pretty exciting time if this is really what we're seeing, because we know we're in the end times for sure, and most likely we know the church has got to be gone soon, because this whole Ezekiel 38, 39 event, especially as you read into 39, you realize this is God dealing directly with the Jewish people again. And so we know that, the church isn't in focus anymore, it's the Jewish people. That the dispensation has changed. And, if you want to follow that through, the church has to be gone for God to turn his attention away. That's just been the history of the Bible. And I know there's people that get all whipped up about dispensationalism. And you don't have to hang every thought of evangelical Christianity onto dispensationalism because there's things that are tied to that potentially, like cessationism, that people just lump into dispensational theology. And all I'm doing is I'm referring to periods of time in which God dealt with an individual group of people to spread his message to the world. And those periods of time sure seem to be obvious in the Bible. So when I talk about dispensationalism, I'm not talking about all the other things that get hung off of that hook. It's just using that framework and recognizing that's how God dealt with the world. He always had his group of people through time who were supposed to bring the message, starting with Adam and Eve, and go down through, Noah, and then Abraham, and, then Jacob, which becomes Israel, the 12 tribes, and, the law and all that. And then you get into, the age of grace or church age. So the dispensation has to change for this to come into full. And so I get excited by that. Now let's take a look here. Rabbi Kaduri was the last one to, spin up a lot of people here. The only prophetic utterance of Kaduri concerning Ariel Sharon was that the Messiah would not appear until Ariel Sharon had died. This is being quoted from, Gallups, who did the research on Rabbi Kaduri's prophecies. Within a little over 2 months after speaking these prophetic words, Sharon was in a coma and Kaduri himself died. And so it seems that you know, Rabbi Kaduri predicted the Messiah coming, some point probably soon after Ariel Sharon passed, which has happened. Now you get this other one, which is really compelling too. Uh, Rabbi Judah ben Samuel, the Jubilee prophecies, and let's just go down through what did he say. Rabbi Judah ben Samuel, when the Ottomans, who are the Turks, who are already a power to be reckoned with on the Bosphorus, in the time of Judah ben Samuel conquered Jerusalem, they will rule over Jerusalem for 8 jubilees. Afterwards, Jerusalem will become a no man's land for 1 jubilee, and then in the 9th jubilee, it will once again come back to the possession of the Jewish nation, which would signify the beginning of the Messianic end time. And if you follow this through, the Ottomans had it for exactly 400 years. That ended in 1917. And then for 150-year Jubilee, it was a no man's land, and it was from 1917 to 1967, the Six-Day War, in which case, the Israelis recaptured Jerusalem. And then, so the 9th Jubilee, then it came back into possession, and it did right on the dot in 1967. And that's signifying the beginning of the Messianic end time. Well, if that's the beginning, that Jubilee ends in 2017. And so the Messianic end time, theoretically would have to fall at some point within that last Jubilee, is the way I would read that. So, that would be before 2017 that the Messianic end time had occurred. So what am I saying? I'm saying potentially, as you read this utterance here from this rabbi, he would have the Messiah coming before 2017. And if you look at Kaduri's prophecy, it sure seems like for this to be Ariel Sharon's death to be pointing to something, it would have to be within a year or so, you would think, year or two of Ariel Sharon dying, or what kind of prophecy would it be? I mean, and then you get this one that seems to be very much in the news right now, that the taking of Crimea, you can begin to hear the footsteps of the Messiah. So do you get kind of what was firing in my brain here is, it seems like these rabbinic prophecies all are pointing to what I would say is the first half of the time period we've got on the chart. Okay, and now I guess one other thing here, and it's just a presumption or a guess, but what does this set of upcoming blood moon tetrads signal? Certainly could be signaling the start of the tribulation period. But I think there was a good observation made by Scotty Clark at Eternal Rhythm Flow, who noted, that in 1948, Israel was established in the land, and in 1967, at the Six-Day War, Jerusalem was recaptured, and then, potentially here this third set of tetrads, and the last 100 years could be that Israel gets their temple. It's speculation, but it's sort of a neat little logical flow. And that Temple Mount's in high anxiety mode right now, as the Palestinians were trying to make a bid to have the Jews not even be able to pray at the wall. And some of the Jewish leaders were talking about tearing down the Al-Aqsa Mosque to start building the temple. So that's in high anxiety mode. And I think it used to be on one of Reese's videos here. I think he used to have something that was a potential start to the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war, but I'm not seeing it on here. But see, all these things would tend to agree and to point to the same thing. So if Antichrist needed to be part of the covenant signing, he would have to be around at the start of the tribulation period, right? He'd have to be there to be part of this signing. And so this all fits together. You'd have the Antichrist being declared soon as the Messiah. You'd have the temple being built because by the midpoint, he has to make the abomination of desolation. During this period of time, a significant number of Jews would have to believe that the Antichrist is the Messiah to fit the John 5 passages that we read. And then, as they got to flee. Israel flees to Petra. So that's going to be my presumption, is that, and I know this is maybe a little heretical, because it sure seems like these rabbis were given a special word, but their prophecies tend to point toward the accepting of the Antichrist rather than the actual arrival of the Messiah, if the rest of these timelines and passages are being interpreted correctly. And I'm a huge Israel supporter. I believe in Genesis 12:3. This isn't a commentary on Israel. I pray for the peace of Israel, or the Jewish people, or even the uh, Jewish belief. I'm just picking on these prophecies tend to point toward um, what would seem to me like the coming of the Antichrist more than the coming of Christ at the end of the tribulation period. So um, I know that's pretty controversial. Don't shred me. I'm, like everybody else, I'm trying to put all this stuff together. And when I read this article here, it just got the wheels spinning that, yeah, if we're coming into the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war, um, and it's signaled by Crimea being taken, if the prophecy is going to be true, it's going to be toward the beginning of the tribulation period, because we know when you read into Ezekiel, um, well, especially in 39, but in 38, God's dealing again with the Jewish people, not the church. So I'll leave you with that, and I guess give me comments below, but be kind. I am very much a pro-Israel supporter, very much a belief that the Jewish people are God's children, and I don't want anybody to confuse that when I take a look at these prophecies. So thanks, and Lord willing, we'll see you again. And I'm a bit anxious, folks. So I know I've done a couple of these videos where I've sounded like, is this the last one? It's because that's kind of where my head's at right now. Again, I'm holding on to it loose enough where I'm not going to be distraught if we got to go, several more months or years. You got to be able to deal with it. But I'll tell you what, I really think we're there. And if anybody's watching this video and they're not positive that they've committed their life to Christ, and you see what potentially is building up in terms of, let me bring that up again, what's building up in terms of all these events that are going to happen, and you know how horrible this time is going to be, the only way of escape, read Luke 21, the last verses there, that you may be counted worthy. And you got to recognize that you're a sinner just like everybody else. And Jesus said, no, not one is good. And is recognizing you're a sinner, just placing your faith and your trust in Jesus' work on the cross to take your sin and his resurrection to open the way to heaven. And then, you know what? If you do that in your heart, you are born again, and you're coming with the train ride that's going to go to heaven. That's the positive end, and I'd say focus on that and put your heart on that, because the rest of this stuff is just so unbelievably horrible. Who would actually want to live through some of this? And if you don't accept Christ while we're in the middle of this, he not only could die, will very likely die a horrible death. You've got eternity in hell. And so it's that critical right now. It's that much, it's that stark of a contrast. We're either going to heaven, potentially even in moments now, days, weeks, whatever, in moments, because you put your full faith and trust in Christ, or you're going to go into this tribulation period and it's just going to be absolutely wicked. And then if you decide to accept Christ because you see what's coming upon the earth, you're going to die a horrible death physically, and that's the only last route to make it to heaven. Um, I just don't want that to happen to anybody. So give your life to Christ now while you still can. There is not time left. Uh, Thanks, Saints.